Hold your position. Eyes on the woods.
Understood, sir.
January 1942. Before dawn settles over the Eastern Front, the temperature sits well below freezing. Snow has hardened into a brittle crust, crunching softly beneath each measured step. A narrow patrol moves through a stand of leafless birch trees, breath fogging the air in short, controlled bursts. Rifles are held low but ready. Steel helmets catch no light. No one speaks. This is routine work. A short reconnaissance patrol, in and out before first light. Beyond the trees, the land opens into a shallow white depression. A frozen field scarred by shell holes now filled with snow. Somewhere ahead, enemy lines lie quiet, indistinguishable from the terrain itself. The men advance anyway, following doctrine, trusting spacing, trusting silence. Then the sound arrives. Not an explosion, not a shout, just a single, sharp crack that snaps the stillness apart. One soldier collapses instantly, his body dropping without warning, rifle slipping from numb fingers. No warning shot, no visible enemy, just a red bloom against the snow and a silence even heavier than before. The patrol freezes. Training collides with fear. Every tree, every shadow, every rise in the terrain becomes suspect. They had expected cold. They had expected boredom. They had expected routine. They had not expected to be seen first. And in that moment, a single unseen sniper has already changed everything, forcing the war, vast and impersonal, to narrow down to one frozen field and a handful of men who now understand how fragile routine truly is. By January 1942, the Eastern Front had already become something no planner in Berlin or Moscow had fully imagined. 6 months earlier, in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa had torn open a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. German armies advanced with speed unmatched in modern warfare, shattering Soviet border defenses and encircling entire formations. Cities fell. Roads clogged with refugees and retreating units. Maps changed faster than orders could follow. But winter came faster still. By December, the German advance had stalled outside Moscow. Temperatures plunged to levels unfamiliar even to seasoned soldiers. Engines froze. Lubricants thickened. Weapons malfunctioned. The Red Army, battered but unbroken, launched counteroffensives that forced the Wehrmacht back from the capital. The front did not collapse, but hardened. What emerged was a new kind of war zone. No longer fluid, no longer defined by sweeping armored thrusts. The battlefield fractured into thousands of contested positions. Forests, villages, frozen rivers, and open fields became lines of separation measured not in kilometers, but in meters. In this environment, large formations mattered less than small groups of men moving carefully through terrain that punished every mistake. This was the world that made the patrol possible and necessary. By early 1942, both sides relied heavily on reconnaissance patrols to understand what lay beyond their immediate positions. Front lines were rarely continuous. Gaps existed everywhere, especially in wooded or marshy terrain. Patrols were sent to identify enemy strongpoints, locate machine gun nests, test wire obstacles, and confirm whether an area was occupied at all. Most patrols returned without incident. Some did not. The Eastern Front's vastness concealed an intimate violence. A soldier could walk for hours without contact, then die within seconds of being seen. There are no clear horizons here, no permanent safety zones. Snow muted sound. Trees broke up sight lines. White camouflage erased movement. and above all, the front-bred specialists. Among them were snipers. The Soviet Union, drawing on pre-war marksmanship programs and hard-earned lessons from Finland's Winter War of 1939-40, placed renewed emphasis on sniper training. Marksmen were no longer lone hunters acting independently. They were increasingly integrated into units, tasked with disrupting enemy movement, targeting officers, and, most critically, denying the enemy any sense of routine. German forces understood the threat quickly. By late 1941, Wehrmacht reports from the Eastern Front repeatedly mentioned sniper activity as a major source of casualties and psychological strain. Soldiers described being afraid to lift their heads from trenches. Patrol leaders hesitated before moving men into open ground. Entire units slowed their tempo because a single hidden rifle could paralyze movement. This fear was not exaggerated. Snipers thrived in static or semi-static fronts. Winter conditions favored patience. A man could lie concealed for hours, his breath controlled, his body insulated by snow and stillness. A single shot, accurate, deliberate, could collapse the illusion of safety that patrols depended upon. Doctrine, however, demanded movement anyway. Patrols were ordered forward despite the risks. Commanders needed information. They needed confirmation that the enemy had not shifted positions overnight. They needed to know where resistance lay thin and where it had grown unexpectedly strong. So small groups moved out before dawn. They followed rehearsed formations. They spaced themselves to limit casualties. They trusted that silence, discipline, and experience would keep them alive. In many cases, it did. But the environment itself was changing. As winter locked the front into place, both sides began to watch each other more closely. Patterns emerged. Patrol routes repeated. Times became predictable. The war, immense in scale, began to shrink down to individual habits. And habits, on the Eastern Front, were lethal. The patrol moving through the birch trees that morning was not reckless. It followed standard procedure. Its men were trained, armed, and alert. Nothing about the mission stood out from dozens carried out before it. What they could not know was that someone else had already studied the same ground, measured the same distances, noted the same pauses in movement. Because in this frozen landscape, reconnaissance worked both ways. And while patrols were sent to observe the enemy, patient, hidden, and already waiting, was watching them just as closely. By the winter of 1941 to 1942, the Eastern Front had settled into a condition that neither side had planned for, yet both were forced to master. Static contact. The front lines were no longer defined by sweeping arrows on operational maps, but by tree lines, frozen streams, shallow ridges, and shell-torn villages half buried under snow. In many sectors, opposing forces lay less than 200 meters apart, separated by terrain that appeared empty yet was saturated with unseen danger. In this environment, doctrine narrowed its focus. Reconnaissance patrols were no longer optional. They were essential. Commanders depended on them to determine whether an enemy trench was occupied, whether wire had been repaired overnight, whether a machine gun position had been abandoned or reinforced. Artillery fire, infantry assaults, and even defensive planning depended on the information brought back by small groups of men moving beyond the safety of their own lines. These patrols followed strict rules. They moved in darkness or low light. They avoided skyline exposure. They maintained spacing to reduce casualties from sudden fire. They spoke only when absolutely necessary. Each man understood his role. The point man watched for tripwires and movement. The rear guard watched for pursuit. The leader measured time constantly, knowing that lingering increased risk exponentially. Yet doctrine, no matter how refined, could not eliminate uncertainty. Winter transformed the battlefield in contradictory ways. Snow muffled sound but magnified visibility. Tracks betrayed movement but were difficult to erase. A fallen branch, a disturbed drift, or a shadow out of place could signal danger, or mean nothing at all. It was in these contradictions that snipers flourished. Unlike regular infantry, snipers did not seek ground, they selected it. They chose positions that offered concealment, stable firing platforms, and overlapping fields of view. Many operated in pairs, a shooter and an observer. Others worked alone, relying on patience rather than communication. Soviet sniper doctrine by this stage of the war emphasized endurance as much as marksmanship. Men were trained to remain motionless for hours, sometimes days, in extreme cold. White camouflage smocks blended into the snow. Rifles such as the Mosin Nagant, often fitted with PU scopes, were zeroed carefully for winter conditions, accounting for air density and temperature. The goal was not volume of fire. The goal was disruption. A single kill could halt movement across an entire sector. A patrol that failed to return forced commanders to assume the worst. Men moved more slowly. Units delayed operations. Confidence eroded quietly, invisibly, one cautious step at a time. German forces adapted as well, developing counter-sniper teams and revising patrol procedures. Helmets were covered in cloth. Routes were varied when possible. Patrols were shortened. Still, the threat remained constant, because the sniper did not need superiority in numbers. He needed only opportunity. By early 1942, both sides understood that patrols were among the most vulnerable elements on the battlefield. They moved predictably. They operated in small numbers. They had no artillery support and limited ability to respond once engaged. And yet, patrols continued. They continued because war demanded information. They continued because commanders could not afford blindness. They continued because standing still was often deadlier than moving forward. This created a silent duel across the front. Patrols probed the darkness, trying to glimpse signs of life beyond the snow. Snipers studied those patrols, learning their rhythms, waiting for the moment when caution relaxed just enough. There were no heroic charges here, no banners, no speeches, only breath held in frozen lungs, only fingers tightening on triggers, only the knowledge that survival depended on seeing first or not being seen at all. And when those two realities collided, the result was never gradual. It was instant. One shot, one body falling, one routine patrol transformed into a moment of chaos. And to understand how that single moment unfolded, and why its impact reached far beyond the man who fell, we must now look at the event from multiple angles, each revealing a different truth hidden within the same frozen field. The human angle of war is rarely as visible as maps or battle reports suggest. It is found in frozen faces, in trembling fingers on triggers, and in the split-second calculations that can mean life or death. For the men on the patrol, that morning in January 1942, humanity itself was tested in ways the planners could never have quantified. Silence dominated the world. Each breath left a misting cloud. Each step crunched over hardened snow. The soldiers were trained for these conditions, trained to move like shadows. But no training could remove the human instincts that rose unbidden. The suspicion of movement, the sudden tightening of the stomach, the quickened heartbeat when something seems out of place. The first man to fall, the one felled by a single sniper's bullet, changed everything. His body hitting the snow shattered more than his own life. It fractured the rhythm of the entire patrol. Fear spread invisibly, creeping into every thought, every hesitation. Men became hyper-aware. Every flicker of wind against a branch, every glint of sunlight off a snowdrift became potential threat. This was not cowardice. It was survival instinct heightened to an unbearable degree. In these moments, the human mind, trained though it might be, reacted to the impossible task of predicting the unseen. A patrol leader faced a cruel choice: retreat and risk exposure to the enemy observing from concealment, or advance and risk falling one by one to an invisible marksman. Each decision was a gamble. Each second was an eternity. The tactical angle reveals how doctrine and training intersected with this raw human response. Patrols moved according to strict formations. Point men, flankers, rear guards, spacing measured in meters to prevent a single shot from killing more than one man. Leaders instructed men to maintain intervals, to scan sectors, to respond only when necessary. Yet doctrine could not account for the environment itself. Snow flattened sound, but amplified visual cues. Trees, once intended as cover, became potential hiding spots for unseen enemies. Open fields, meant to provide clear sight lines, became death traps if a sniper had chosen the high ground. Every step had to be weighed against the probability of observation. Commanders had learned to adjust for terrain, for wind, for line of sight, but no algorithm could eliminate the risk entirely. Tactical planning, in this sense, was a negotiation with chance and a single failure. One misstep, one delayed glance, could transform hours of careful procedure into catastrophe. Technology, the third angle, played its own decisive role. Rifles, optics, and camouflage determine outcomes as much as human skill. The patrol carried standard-issue Kar 98KS or Mosin, Nagants, rifles designed for reliability even in sub-zero temperatures. Scopes magnified targets, but only for those who could maintain calm hands, steady breathing, and proper distance estimation. Camouflage mattered. White overcoats blended soldiers into snow, but it could be betrayed by movement, shadow, or reflected light. The sniper on the other side relied on similar technology, yet for different purposes. Where patrol rifles were tools for general defense, a sniper's weapon was optimized for precision and patience. Every piece of equipment, every scope adjustment, every careful zeroing in of sights became a conversation between human and machine, a conversation that could end instantly with a single shot. Beyond the rifles, there were optics, binoculars, rangefinders, and even basic knowledge of ballistics in cold weather. Snow density, temperature, and wind drift all became variables in an equation that demanded perfection for success. Technology, in these conditions, was both shield and scalpel, and in the wrong hands or in the wrong place, it could define life and death. These three angles, human, tactical, and technological, did not operate independently. They collided, intertwined, and created the conditions for sudden catastrophe. Men trained to move in silence became machines under pressure, yet their instincts remained human. Doctrine demanded movement, but terrain and circumstance dictated extreme caution. Weapons enabled engagement, but also imposed limits, demanding skill beyond ordinary human capability. In that frozen field, each angle magnified the others. Human fear slowed tactical efficiency, tactical stress amplified human error, and technology amplified both the power and the consequences of mistakes. Within this nexus of factors, the unseen sniper became more than a soldier. He became a force of inevitability. He was not simply a man pulling a trigger. He was the intersection of human fear, tactical exposure, and technological precision. Every patrolman's heartbeat, every pause in movement, every breath in the cold air fed into the sniper's advantage. In turn, his action reshaped the entire human and tactical landscape of the patrol. What had begun as routine reconnaissance became a microcosm of the war itself. Deliberate, precise, and unyielding, yet profoundly personal in its consequences. The psychological dimension deserves special attention. Fear, unlike bullets, is indiscriminate. It spreads faster than sound in snow, faster than orders can travel. Once the first man fell, the patrol's cohesion cracked. Men flinched at every distant noise. Commands were given, but not always heard. Eyes darted to every shadow. The human mind, aware of the sniper's presence yet unable to locate him, became a secondary battlefield. In many patrol encounters, this invisible struggle determined outcomes as much as any rifle shot. Fear forced hesitation. Hesitation slowed movement, and slowed movement made men predictable targets. Doctrine and discipline, which had been drilled relentlessly, now competed with raw survival instinct, and instinct often won. From the technological perspective, winter did not merely complicate rifles or optics, it transformed the battlefield itself. Snow reflected sunlight, masking or revealing movement depending on angle. Cold contracted metal, subtly altering rifle zero. Frost could obscure scope lenses, and even a minor imperfection could mean the difference between a clean shot and a miss. Yet the sniper, trained to account for such variables, turned these same conditions into advantage. For the patrol, their rifles were instruments of defense, but in this environment, they were blunt tools in the face of a patient, calculating adversary. By the end of the patrol's first hour in the field, the interplay of these angles had already begun to dictate outcomes. The men's human instincts were heightened, their tactical procedures constrained, their technology operating at its limits. Every movement carried weight. Every pause carried risk. And in this crucible, it would take only one precise act, a single shot from an unseen marksman, to alter not just the patrol's immediate fate, but the perception of safety for all future operations in that sector. If the human, tactical, and technological dimensions defined the immediate experience of the patrol, leadership framed its choices and its consequences. The patrol leader, usually a junior officer or non-commissioned officer, carried a responsibility that was at once practical, doctrinal, and moral. Every step he ordered, every pause he allowed, and every decision to advance or retreat was magnified by the lethal potential of the environment. The presence of a sniper, whether known or suspected, transformed ordinary command into a complex calculus. Leadership demanded maintaining discipline while confronting the unknown, balancing courage with caution, and enforcing doctrine while anticipating improvisation. For the men under his command, his judgment was the thin line separating calculated risk from disaster. Hesitate, and he risked the cohesion of the patrol. Act rashly, and he risked their lives. The psychological burden was immense. On the frozen Eastern Front, leadership was not abstract. It was immediate and visceral. A single misjudgment, ordering men into a small clearing, pausing too long near a ridge, or failing to notice the smallest glint on the snow, could cost lives instantly. Patrol leaders often carried this weight silently, their focus shifting rapidly between terrain, weather, men, and the unseen enemy. Reports from Eastern Front diaries and after-action assessments repeatedly highlight the intense pressure on small unit leaders, whose decisions, sometimes taken within seconds, had disproportionate consequences. When a sniper made the first kill, it was not just a physical threat. It was an existential test of command. The leader had to respond, often without complete information, while the human instinct for self-preservation pressed against every order. The enemy perspective, in this case, represents both the physical and psychological threat of a single marksman, but also the broader strategy that allowed such threats to exist. Snipers were not acting in isolation. They were integrated into the larger operational logic of the Eastern Front. Soviet doctrine emphasized harassing enemy formations, disrupting communications, and instilling persistent fear. A single sniper did not need to engage an entire patrol to achieve strategic value. Observing, choosing the moment, and executing with precision could create ripple effects far beyond the immediate field. From the enemy's viewpoint, a successful patrol engagement reinforced the psychological and tactical advantage of patient, concealed observation. Intelligence reports from the period frequently noted the disproportionate effect snipers had on morale, the increased caution in patrol movements, and the way entire units slowed down under the specter of unseen fire. The enemy's objective was not necessarily to kill every man, but to force hesitation, to extract compliance, and to leverage fear as a force multiplier. Finally, The moral angle confronts the stark realities of such encounters. A routine patrol, carrying out orders that seemed mundane, becomes the site of ethical tension in the cold calculus of war. Soldiers on both sides were trained to view the enemy as targets rather than individuals. Yet the human mind cannot fully suppress the recognition of life ending in the snow, in silence, often at point-blank range. The moral dimension exists not in grandiose heroism, but in the quiet moments when men reconcile survival, duty, and the randomness of violence. The patrol leader faces moral decisions under extreme pressure: advance and risk more lives, or withdraw and potentially fail the mission. The sniper, hidden and patient, embodies a different moral ambiguity. One person taking deliberate aim, achieving a decisive effect with minimal engagement, forcing others to grapple with the weight of an unseen hand. War reduces morality to calculation, yet the human conscience persists. Diaries, letters, and memoirs from both sides recount soldiers haunted by the knowledge of unseen enemies and invisible deaths, reflecting that moral tension is inseparable from tactical reality. Taken together, these three perspectives, leadership, enemy, and moral, reveal the invisible threads binding the battlefield. Leadership dictates decisions under uncertainty. The enemy leverages knowledge and concealment to magnify effect. Morality, or at least the perception of it, influences hesitation, aggression, and risk-taking. Each angle intersects with the human, tactical, and technological dimensions already examined, creating a lattice of factors that determined not only the fate of this single patrol, but the conduct of similar operations across the front. In practical terms, the patrol that morning had already begun to experience these intersecting pressures. The first man had fallen. Movement slowed. Every decision was measured, every pause scrutinized. The leader's voice, once a tool of command, now carried weight as a potential source of security or hazard. Each shadow could hide the enemy. Every slope could conceal a rifle. Every snowdrift a concealed observer. Training dictated action. Instinct urged caution. Doctrine demanded completion of the mission. Within this tension, the enemy observed and calculated. In a broader operational sense, a single sniper had already imposed strategic effect, altering behavior across units without firing another shot. This complexity illustrates why the story of a patrol is never merely about the men who move across the snow. It is about the invisible forces at play, the discipline and fear, the precision of marksmanship, the weight of command, and the moral choices imposed by circumstance. History, when viewed through this lens, is shaped as much by perception, anticipation, and human psychology as by the material power of armies. And in this fragile convergence of human will, leadership, enemy strategy, and moral consequence, the decisive moment approaches. A single bullet, a measured decision, a misstep in discipline, all converge in the same instant. It is in this crucible that routine patrols end, and the unexpected begins. One moment will redefine the patrol, one shot will transform the environment, and one unseen hand will create a turning point that ripples far beyond a frozen field. The patrol moved carefully along the edge of a frozen depression, the snow crunching under boots that had long since gone numb. The leader's eyes scanned the tree line, calculating angles of approach, measuring distance, and counting the seconds between breaths. Each man felt the weight of anticipation pressing against his chest, a tension that was invisible but no less suffocating than the cold. Then it happened. A sharp, metallic crack echoed across the field, louder than it should have been in the muffling snow. The sound carried not the resonance of a distant rifle, but the intimate, focused energy of a shot designed to reach its mark with precision. The point man, who had been leading the patrol, stiffened. His eyes widened for an instant before the inevitable, the impact. He dropped without a sound, the snow around him staining a vivid red. Chaos followed instantly. The patrol froze, motionless, as if the first man's fall had temporarily halted time. Silence pressed in from every direction, Yet the air itself seemed charged with danger. Breaths became visible, harsh and ragged. Fingers tightened on cold steel. Training fought instinct. Doctrine struggled against the pulse of fear. Every man knew that the sniper had not merely fired at one target. He had claimed the patrol's rhythm, their confidence, their sense of security. The leader barked orders, short, clipped, almost mechanical. Down, spread, cover. The men obeyed, sinking behind the sparse cover of tree trunks and snowbanks. But the terrain was merciless. Open stretches left them exposed. Shallow depressions offered limited protection. Even small movements risked visibility. Every decision was a negotiation with an enemy who could not be seen, but whose presence dominated the field. The sniper, patient and concealed, observed every reaction. From a ridge obscured by birch and snow, his position was almost impossible to detect. He had studied the patrol's likely path, anticipated pauses, and waited until the maximum psychological leverage had been achieved. Every heartbeat, every cautious glance, every slight tremor in the soldier's movements fed into his advantage. He was not merely a shooter. He was a force manipulating fear, exploiting discipline, and reshaping the battlefield in a single, calculated act. As the patrol attempted to regroup, the second man moved instinctively to drag the fallen point man into a small snowbank for temporary cover. Another shot rang out. The snow near his feet erupted in a spray of ice crystals, a warning precise and deliberate. The sniper did not need to kill again immediately. The first shot had already imposed paralysis, and this second, warning shot reinforced it. Soldiers hesitated, reluctant to move. Leadership, under pressure, weighed every order. Advance and risk more lives, retreat and fail the mission. The choice was unbearable, the seconds stretching impossibly long. From a tactical perspective, the patrol's formation unraveled. Spacing that had seemed sufficient became inadequate under unseen observation. Men clustered instinctively behind trees, behind depressions, their attention divided between the threat above all else and the mission they had been sent to complete. In open terrain, every step was fraught with potential. The sniper's advantage multiplied geometrically with every motion, every instinctive flinch. Doctrine, which had emphasized controlled, measured movement, collided violently with the human instinct to survive. Every hesitation, every misstep created a new opportunity for the marksman waiting silently in the cold. Technology, too, defined the outcome. The patrol's rifles were ready but could not be fired without revealing positions or making movement more dangerous. Scopes and sights were useless without line of sight. The sniper's weapon, zeroed for long range, capable of accounting for wind, temperature, and snow density, operated with lethal certainty. He needed only to wait for the exact moment, to see a shoulder, an arm, a hint of motion before making his next calculation. The environment itself amplified his precision. Snow reflected light that gave away positions. Frost muffled his own movements, and branches shielded his silhouette. In this frozen landscape, every variable worked in his favor. Minutes, or perhaps seconds, stretched into an eternity. Then, a single decision broke the tension. The patrol leader signaled a slow withdrawal along a zigzagging path intended to minimize exposure. Movement was deliberate, controlled, but every man felt the weight of observation on his back, imagined and real. The sniper did not fire again immediately. He observed, calculated, waited. Each second of inaction was as dangerous as any shot. The psychological hold he had established forced hesitation, forced caution, and turned every action into potential failure. And yet, even as fear dominated, survival instincts pushed men forward. Eyes scanned for cover. Fingers adjusted rifles, not yet fired but ready. Every heartbeat, every careful step, Every whisper between soldiers was an act of defiance against the invisible, relentless pressure of the sniper. In that frozen moment, the war was not fought in miles, but in meters. The outcome depended on observation, patience, and the discipline to act in spite of terror. This is the precise moment when routine shattered. The patrol, trained and disciplined, became prey to patience, skill, and calculated observation. One shot had altered the course of events. One bullet had transformed a simple mission into a test of nerve, calculation, and endurance. The invisible enemy had achieved what brute force could not: the complete disruption of movement, command, and confidence. And in the snow, with frost-burning cheeks and fingers stiff from cold, the patrol realized that the front lines could no longer be measured simply by distance. They were defined by presence, by observation, and by the unseen hand of a marksman who had already claimed the field. The decisive moment, the shot, was over. Its impact, however, had only begun. The patrol, reduced to cautious, measured steps, now faced the choice that would define the remainder of this encounter: withdrawal, improvisation, or continued engagement in the teeth of an invisible threat. Every decision from this point forward would carry the weight of consequences far larger than the field itself. The frozen field, once seemingly empty and predictable, had become a stage of invisible menace. The patrol moved cautiously, each footfall deliberate, each glance measured. But the first shot had done more than wound a man. It had fractured the cohesion that doctrine and training had spent months instilling. The soldiers no longer moved as a unit. They moved as individuals, constrained by fear, by hesitation, and by the silent presence of the sniper, who could strike at any moment. Orders from the patrol leader came in clipped bursts. Left, down, move slowly, but the voices, muffled by the cold and the shock, carried unevenly. Men froze mid-step, unsure whether to obey or maintain their own sense of self-preservation. Even the experienced rear guard, trained to cover retreating comrades, hesitated, eyes darting to every shadow. The careful formations drilled into them seemed almost irrelevant. Spacing no longer guaranteed safety. Discipline no longer guaranteed survival. The sniper exploited this instantly. From a concealed position behind a mound of snow and birch saplings, he calculated every opportunity. The first shot had established control. The second had instilled doubt. And now he waited for overextension, for any instinctive movement that betrayed exposure. The patrol's rhythm, the very thing that allowed soldiers to operate in dangerous terrain, had collapsed. Movement became jerky, hesitant, and fragmented. One man stumbled on uneven snow, sending a spray of powdery white into the air, a signal the sniper needed only to aim at, and yet he waited. Patience had become as powerful a weapon as the rifle itself. Leadership, normally the linchpin of small unit operations, began to fail under the cumulative weight of fear and uncertainty. The patrol leader attempted to coordinate withdrawal while keeping men in cover, but the lines of sight were compromised, distances misjudged in the blinding white, and every suggestion of order was punctuated by the possibility of instant death. Decisions had to be made with incomplete information: where to move, how quickly, which men to protect first. Every command risked exposing someone. Every pause risked more casualties. The very act of leadership became perilous, not from enemy fire alone, but from the mental strain of maintaining cohesion under invisible threat. Technology, too, imposed limits. Rifles were ready, but could not be brought to bear without revealing positions. Scopes were ineffective without clear lines of sight. Snow reflected the low morning sun, casting false images across the field. Every action amplified risk. The sniper, in contrast, could afford patience. He was static, measured, and in control of timing. His field of view was uninterrupted. His preparation had transformed the environment into a weapon that moved in concert with his patience, using every shadow and glint as part of the calculation. The patrol's rifles, once tools of confidence, were now instruments of paralysis, emphasizing the lethality of inactivity more than action. As the minutes stretched, disorientation grew. Soldiers' perceptions of distance, sound, and threat became unreliable. A branch snapped under a gloved hand and froze men mid-motion. Mist from breath condensed into clouds that blurred vision. The field that had seemed navigable moments before now felt like a labyrinth. The patrol's progression slowed to a crawl. Eyes darted to every ridge and hollow. Every instinctive response to sound or movement was suspect. What had begun as a mission of reconnaissance had become an exercise in survival, where every micro-decision could lead to death. The psychological effect compounded with the physical. Fear became a tangible force pressing on every muscle, every thought. Hesitation bred more hesitation. Coordination faltered. The patrol split unintentionally into smaller groups, each moving semi-independently, each with reduced ability to support one another. The sniper, now observing not just bodies but broken patterns, was in complete control. He did not need to fire again to maintain dominance. The patrol's fear had done the work for him. What remained of human discipline and tactical doctrine was overwhelmed by the invisible pressure of a single, calculated presence. This collapse was total, yet invisible. To an outsider, the men might have appeared cautious, deliberate, methodical, but internally, chaos reigned. The first casualty had already destabilized confidence. The second shot had eroded trust in the environment. By the third, fourth, or fifth hesitation, the patrol's cohesion had dissolved. Each man moved for himself. Every command had to be repeated multiple times, and the tactical advantage that doctrine had promised was entirely lost. The battlefield, measured in frozen meters, had become a psychological crucible where fear dictated every action. The sniper's single bullet had multiplied in effect, shaping outcomes far beyond the initial impact. As the patrol staggered backward, inch by inch, they began to understand the full cost of routine. What had been a simple, disciplined movement across snow had become a trial of nerve, patience, and resilience. One small mistake could trigger further casualties. One poorly timed movement could be fatal. And as the men finally reached relative cover, the invisible presence of the sniper remained, a constant threat, shaping decisions, freezing bodies, and redefining the patrol's perception of safety. The routine was gone. Control was gone. The front, vast and impersonal moments before, had narrowed to a handful of men, a frozen field, and one unseen rifle capable of commanding the outcome of every action. The moment of collapse did not end with a single event. It lingered, extending through every subsequent decision, every cautious glance, every measured step. The patrol had survived, but only just. They had been tested not by overwhelming force, but by precision, patience, and psychological mastery. The sniper had proven the potency of calculated inaction, showing that dominance on the battlefield could be imposed not by quantity, but by understanding, timing, and control of perception. The frozen landscape, once a canvas for routine reconnaissance, had been transformed into a theater of fear, where human will, doctrine, and technology collided and fractured under invisible pressure. The patrol's withdrawal, measured and painful, was the immediate result. Yet this moment would resonate far beyond the snow-laden depression. Commanders, later analyzing reports, would adjust doctrine. Soldiers would move differently in similar terrain. The psychological precedent set by a single, calculated shot would ripple through the sector, shaping behavior and decisions far beyond the patrol itself. History, at this scale, can hinge on the precision of one act, the patience of one soldier, and the collapse of control it imposes on those who must respond. The patrol had survived, but it had been irreversibly changed. The snow that had once been merely cold and unforgiving now carried the imprint of violence. 2 soldiers lay wounded, 1 dead. Their uniforms, white against the frozen field, were stained with red, a stark, unignorable contrast that marked the moment when routine had given way to catastrophe. Commanders would later count the losses and note them on paper. 1 man killed, 2 wounded, patrol delayed. But on the ground, the numbers told only part of the story. The human cost went far beyond immediate casualties. Fear lingered long after the shots had fallen. Men who had trained to act in disciplined synchrony now moved in fractured patterns. Even those uninjured felt their nerves frayed, every heartbeat echoing the memory of the first crack of the sniper's rifle. The psychological effect was immediate, visceral, and undeniable. Men reported trembling hands, cold sweat despite freezing temperatures, and sudden hesitations that disrupted coordination. The patrol had been trained to follow doctrine, but the invisible hand of the sniper had demonstrated that discipline alone could not guarantee survival. Every movement forward became tentative. Every glance over a shoulder carried the weight of potential death. These reactions, though subtle, were enough to transform routine reconnaissance into an operation dominated by caution and fear. Tactically, the patrol was effectively neutralized for the remainder of the mission. The original objective, scouting enemy positions, assessing fortifications, and returning with actionable intelligence, was abandoned in favor of survival. Every decision now prioritized cover over observation, caution over accomplishment. The formation had fractured during withdrawal, reducing communication, mutual support, and firepower. Even when the soldiers found temporary concealment, their ability to respond effectively to further threats was diminished. Reports from similar Eastern Front patrols confirm this pattern. After an initial sniper engagement, units often retraced their steps, postponed objectives, or retreated entirely, recognizing that the cost of inaction outweighed any potential gain. In these microcosms of the front, the tactical balance shifted with every unseen threat. The battlefield itself had become a secondary casualty. Snow and terrain that had been neutral ground now acted as both weapon and witness. Footprints traced frantic paths, indicating the patrol's disordered withdrawal. Tree trunks, once mere obstacles or cover, were now markers of the patrol's panic-driven movements. Every disturbed patch of snow reflected the sudden intrusion of chaos. The sniper, having executed his mission with calculated patience, had altered the environment permanently. The frozen field, the ridge, the birch groves, they were no longer passive backdrops. They had become participants in the violence, shaping movement and imposing psychological pressure on anyone who entered. Communication with headquarters revealed the broader implications of the engagement. The patrol's delayed return prompted alerts and concern as commanders struggled to understand why a routine mission had faltered. Orders were issued for increased reconnaissance, but these too were tempered by caution, demonstrating that the immediate consequences of one sniper shot extended beyond the men on the ground. Entire units adjusted their patrol routines, increasing spacing, varying routes, and reducing exposure time. The sniper had imposed effects far greater than a single bullet, reshaping operational behavior in the sector without further engagement. Even among surviving soldiers, the human consequences were profound. Letters and diaries from similar encounters on the Eastern Front describe lingering fear, hypervigilance, and disrupted sleep. Training and experience provided only partial relief. The memory of an unseen enemy capable of instant lethality remained. For some, the psychological impact lasted days, even weeks. Immediate recovery required more than medical care. It required a reassertion of confidence, leadership, and control over an environment that had proven unpredictable and deadly. In essence, the sniper had transformed a routine patrol into a tactical and psychological turning point. The men were alive, but the mission had failed. Every instinct, every piece of training, and every protocol had been tested against an opponent who relied on patience, precision, and control. The immediate consequence was clear: casualties, disrupted cohesion, and delayed objectives. The ripple effect extended farther than the frozen depression, forcing adjustments in patrol strategy, communication, and command decisions across the sector. A single deliberate action had reshaped not only the patrol's experience, but also the operational environment in which they functioned. And yet, these immediate consequences were only the beginning. Beyond the patrol's limited perimeter, the effects of fear, adaptation, and altered behavior would extend into the wider theater of operations, influencing doctrine, morale, and the perception of what was safe and what was not. The story of one shot, one patrol, and one frozen field was far from over. The consequences of that single shot extended far beyond the frozen field. Commanders on both sides quickly recognized that small, precise engagements could shape the tempo of operations more effectively than conventional assaults. Reports from the Eastern Front in early 1942 repeatedly noted the psychological power of snipers. A single marksman could halt patrols, disrupt reconnaissance, and slow offensive momentum without firing repeatedly. The perception of danger became as potent as the actual threat. Doctrine shifted in response. Patrols were shortened, routes were varied, and movements were staggered to reduce predictability. Sniper detection and counter-sniper teams became priorities. Observers were assigned to high ground, and camouflage standards were tightened. Even experienced soldiers were reminded that the invisible enemy demanded constant vigilance. Discipline alone no longer guaranteed safety. Morale, too, was affected. The fear of unseen threats eroded confidence in routine operations. Veterans who had walked the front without incident now approached every patrol with heightened caution. Letters, diaries, and post-battle reports describe men haunted by the knowledge that any field could conceal a sniper, any shadow might hide death. These intangible effects reshaped behavior sector-wide, slowing movement, tightening formations, and embedding paranoia into daily operations. In essence, a single rifle had rewritten part of the battlefield. It demonstrated that warfare on the Eastern Front was no longer solely a contest of numbers or firepower. It was a duel of patience, calculation, and psychological dominance. From one frozen field to the surrounding sector, the sniper's impact endured, altering tactics, doctrine, and the very perception of control. War is often measured in miles, divisions, and artillery shells. But sometimes it is defined by a single heartbeat, a frozen field, and one unseen rifle. The patrol that morning in January 1942 survived, yet its routine, its confidence, and its sense of control were forever altered. A single act of precision, born of patience and skill, transformed an ordinary mission into a lesson in fragility. It revealed how easily human order can unravel when exposed to an invisible, calculating force. In that moment, the vast machinery of the Eastern Front contracted into a handful of men and one bullet. The front, with its thousands of kilometers and countless soldiers, became a microcosm of human vulnerability, discipline, and fear. Doctrine and technology, formidable in theory, bowed to the reality of perception and psychology. Leadership, training, and preparation mattered, but they could only mitigate the threat. They could not eliminate it entirely. Yet there is a strange clarity in this. The sniper's shot, precise and deliberate, illuminated the unseen dynamics of warfare. the tension between initiative and caution, the weight of decisions and uncertainty, and the persistent presence of fear as a tactical factor. It showed that even the smallest actors on a battlefield can shape events far beyond their immediate sphere. One moment, one decision, one act of patience could ripple outward, influencing strategy, behavior, and morale across entire sectors. The frozen field remained, unremarkable to anyone who passed by afterward, but it carried the memory of that encounter. It reminds us that history is made not only in grand battles and sweeping maneuvers, but also in brief, intensely human moments of confrontation. And in these moments, the fragility of routine, the precision of skill, and the weight of human fear converge, leaving lessons far larger than the field itself. In war, as in life, control is never absolute, and the smallest act can leave consequences that echo long after the snow has melted.